What up, my friend? Insanely simple. The obsession that drives Apple's success. Ken Segall, the man who named iMac. Chapter 7 Sync Casual. I want to read this, and I guess I'll just read here quietly. Planners are supposed to condense all this information into a digestible form that will guide the creative people in developing the most effective work. They are also essential in crafting the marketing strategies that serve as the foundation for the creative work. The offending party was a planner. We'll call him Hank, so as not to damage his career. In the agency world, planners are those who are paid to represent the consumer's point of view, as opposed to the agency's or the client's point of view. They are the ones who are supposed to figure out what customers are thinking, providing the insights as to what messages might make them more likely to buy. Planners are supposed to condense all this information into a digestible form that will guide the creative people in developing the most effective work. They are also essential in crafting the marketing strategies that serve as the foundation for the creative work. Hank was a new hire at the agency. He was a smart guy who had just arrived from one of the most creative agencies in the country, where he worked on the advertising for an account that had achieved iconic status. The aura of his previous job was all over his resume, and he was welcomed with open arms. Where he worked on the advertising for an account that had achieved iconic status. The aura of his previous job was all over his resume, and he was welcomed with open arms. It was decided that Hank would get his feet wet by doing a brand audit for Apple. He would assess the health of the Apple brand among different demographic groups and ethnicities. His prize was that he'd be able to present his audit to Steve Jobs personally. Hank had 2 weeks to do his work, and he dived headfirst into his research. He was eagerly anticipating his meeting with Steve and was determined to do everything in his power to blow him away. Be careful what you wish for, Hank. A week before our trip up to Apple, Hank asked if I would take a look at his presentation. Since I had a good idea of what type of thing Steve responded to best, I was cramped that day, so we put it off the next day. Unfortunately, our schedules never got in sync. Day after day, we kept missing each other, and before we knew it, we were flying up to Apple and had never ever seen his presentation. Lee Clow had been working with him, though, so I wasn't concerned. I would just enjoy it as it unfolded, along with Steve. We got to the Apple boardroom 15 minutes before meeting time. Hank was carrying one of those awkwardly large portfolio cases containing his presentation materials, and he immediately started to set up. The fact that he had things to set up was the first indication that something was amiss. Our out came a large graph, followed by a chart with lots of numbers and photos of different kinds of customers. I started to wince, knowing that Steve wasn't a fan of these types of presentations. That's big company stuff. I felt bad that Hank and I had never been able to connect during the week because this was starting to look more and more risky. He might well be walking into a death trap. By the time Hank had emptied his portfolio, there were 4 large pieces of foam core on the wall, and Hank stood there doing his mental calisthenics. I thought about saying something, but it was way too late for that. So I started doing what any brave and advertising guy would do. I made sure I sat outside the line of fire. When Steve showed up, Lee introduced him to the newest member of our team. He briefly summarized Hank's credentials and explained that he had been working hard on this Apple brand audit, which was something we'd never done before but probably should have. Steve nodded in acceptance, though he seemed more polite than actually interested. The wall upon which Hank was presenting was actually behind Steve, so Steve swerved his chair halfway to see the show. His body language was fascinating to watch. He started off at full attention and, minute by minute, sank lower and lower into his chair. He was clearly bored. If it hadn't been for the fact that Lee Close thought this was a good idea, Steve would have been considerably less polite. His respect for Lee may have stopped him from shutting down the presentation, but it didn't stop him from heckling. After just a few minutes, he started interrupting to throw out questions. The more it appeared that Steve wasn't buying it, the more nervous Hank became. A few more minutes into the show, Hank was taking Steve through the different demographic groups he had researched in different cities. We even went to the ghetto in Harlem and asked the kids on the basketball courts what they thought about Apple. Steve interrupted yet again. Why'd you ask them? Why'd you ask them? He said, they don't have any money. Steve wasn't so much being heartless as just getting more and more annoyed that there was nothing useful in this presentation. Hank fumbled for an answer, and Steve slumped into his seat to the point where he was practically at full recline. He was resting his head in his hand in such a way that he was only peeking at the presentation between 2 fingers covering his eyes. Now he was just plain appalled. Lee realized he had to act now, or a smart young planner would be psychologically scarred for life. He interrupted Hank to tell Steve that we wanted to share this research because we thought it was important that we all understand exactly what the Apple brand stands for today, because that might well influence the messages we put out. Steve listened to Lee, but it was clear that he wasn't buying a word of it. In fact, he was getting more and more irritated that we were wasting his time with this. He looked at Lee with that "I don't get it" expression and took a deep breath. Okay, whatever, Steve said. Let's look at some ads. It was as if Hank had ceased to exist. Hank wasn't finished with his presentation, but Steve had just finished for him. It was pretty clear that Hank's career as Steve's respected partner in research had just started and ended, all within the span of 20 minutes. This was a black mark for the agency, as it had allowed itself to fall into the trap of acting like a typical agency, the kind of agency that Steve didn't like at all. To him, such presentations were the trappings of agencies that dealt in style over substance. It drove Steve batty to see in 20 slides what could be spoken in 3 sentences. He valued time way too much for that. He preferred straight talk and raw content to a slick presentation. In fact, a slick presentation would only make him suspect that you were fluffing up the few facts you really had. It meant that you devoted valuable time to the wrapping of your idea rather than thinking through the idea itself. Steve was most comfortable with a table, a whiteboard, and an honest exchange of ideas. He resisted anything that made it feel like relationships were becoming formal, or like Apple might be beginning to display behaviors typical of a big corporation. He liked the atmosphere in the room to be such that he could put his bare feet up on the table if he felt like it, which is something he really did do. Well, Steve Jobs. I love it. I love it so much. Alright, thank you for reading with me. See you later. Bye.